are listening to Therapy Plus, a mental health podcast.
The views and opinions expressed by the guest speaker on this episode are solely those of the guest. The content shared is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice or endorsement.
The 8 root fundamentals of mental, emotional, spiritual skill development. I'm Dorian, and this is a bit of an elaboration into what I've determined to be the foundational bedrock of long-lasting, deeply rooted mental health. My journey began many years ago when I was a young man, growing up in a household that I would describe as intellectual atheists. My parents were both teachers, people of science, both not having a very high degree of emotional intelligence. My father even more so, who was often verbally and psychologically abusive, and even to the degree of somewhat physically abusive, in that he, more than one occasion, threatened myself and my mother's life in drunken rages on the road. So that was sort of my beginning place, as I was growing up in a violent neighborhood and violent schools where gangs were prevalent and drug dealing, and saw my first shootings and stabbings as a young man. I was interested in martial arts, and through that journey, I was then introduced to a martial arts teacher who believed in mental states, in achieving these states through meditation and practices that would be conducive to what we might today call flow states, that would cause an increase in effectiveness and competency in, say, a self-defense type situation. And it turned out that I found out after a few years of training with him, as I began to reach into my mid to late teen years, that he was using psychedelics, and I became interested. And in the 90s, there was a deep stigma around this idea of psychedelics, especially LSD, mushrooms. All of it was really considered very taboo. And the idea that you were like damaging yourself, damaging your brain, that if you took one tab of LSD, you were, 5150. When I found out that my martial arts teacher was using these to supercharge his meditation sessions with this idea that I could achieve better competency in self-defense because I was dealing with violence pretty regularly, there was a strong draw there. The problem was there was no real mentorship. He didn't mentor me in that journey, nor did he encourage me to go down that path. And so I got to see a very dynamic viewpoint of psychedelics, because I had extremely positive experiences and some very negative ones. And I also saw some disastrous results as fallout from some of my friends and people I knew that slipped into psychosis on psychedelics and had terrible outcomes. Some of them died. Some of them were never quite the same. Some were not functional afterwards for very long periods of time. And that left a strong impression. But I also experienced a very positive side. So it was quite a dualistic experience that I had. And after my father's death, which happened in 2002, I had a strained relationship with him because of the circumstances of my upbringing with him. I experienced my first true mental health challenges and was struggling. I got to experience the Western psychiatric medicine trajectory of treatment. I was prescribed a whole slew of medications. I was told, because I was very forthright about my usage of psychedelics and substances, that I was brain damaged and I would have to stay on medications my entire life. And this led to a very deep sense of hopelessness and doom, and I became suicidal. During that time period, I did meet a good therapist who did not try to prescribe me medications and who did help to explain further the impacts and the significance of grief, especially based on some of the circumstances around my relationship with my father. But you have to understand, I was in such denial about my father. I didn't realize my father was truly abusive and really see it that way till many years after he died, and I had done a lot of introspection and emotional processing work that I finally really realized that I'd been living in a fog of denial on so many things for a long time. Well, on this journey, I then distanced myself from psychedelics for a while, got involved in cannabis trade, was chasing money, met a woman in 2008 and fell deeply in love with her. And then by 2014, December 10th, we found her body. She died very tragically. And it was extremely devastating loss. And that loss triggered a kind of domino effect where I got back involved with psychedelics. And on that journey, and I was also still involved with martial arts, I met an extremely adept and competent teacher. In fact, the best teacher I've ever met in my life. And he expressed concepts through the lens of fundamental skills, fundamental foundational beginning points for developing skills. And that began to shape my ideas indirectly at first around mental health. When I had gone through the death of my father after meeting that therapist I stated was a decent therapist, I actually also met what I would call a breath coach, who's a Qigong teacher. And, Qigong is the overguiding principle of things like acupuncture, acupressure, Tai Chi. The Falun Gong monks are practicing a spiritual form of Qigong. I was taught a quote unquote medical form of breath work. And that did actually save my life. That was what saved me from suicide. And so I carried that with me for many years, but I never integrated into a system of understanding mental health. And so by the time I was dealing with this tragic death of my girlfriend, I was then far more mature, had a lot more life experience, and had met this extremely competent and effective teacher in the martial arts mentor that I have had for many years now. And I began to think in terms of what are the foundational fundamentals. While my girlfriend had still been alive, I had a hint of this because while she was alive, the relationship was also difficult. And I had got a sense through those challenges in that relationship of what true love really is, real love, what maybe Buddhists might call noble love. And that I boiled down to 3 root fundamentals. And with that experience and spending this time with this martial arts mentor, I began to develop these mental, emotional, spiritual skill development root fundamentals. And so the first root fundamental that I realized was of extreme importance was the processing of past trauma. And this can be done in a number of ways. I was exposed to a very specific type and approach to processing past trauma, and one that I've developed over the many years of practicing this now. And that was out of a book recommendation from the architect of my family home, who lived to be almost 102 years old, I believe. And he had recommended that I read a book called The Journey, A Practical Guide to Healing Your Life and Setting Yourself Free by a woman named Brandon Bays. And as they say, never judge a book by its cover. This thing looked like a Lamaze class kind of book for like pregnant women or something. It was just so pink and so feminine. And I'll be very honest with you, I probably would not have read the book if the recommendation had not come from such a really so well-respected source in our family. And so I took it seriously. I read the book, and I began to resonate with the idea of the techniques within it, which I would briefly describe as a kind of concoction or mixture of guided meditation, a bit of hypnosis, and Gestalt therapy. Just a simplistic form of explaining what it is. And I began searching for someone to do this work with. I couldn't, at the time, really find any seminars that were nearby that Brandon was holding. I didn't find anything like that. And I finally found someone in actually the owner and founder of the company that's the main design team for the website Psychedelist. And at the time, of course, we weren't even working on that. But we both had traumas. We both had things that were really deeply bothering us. We'd both been through difficult, traumatic times of our lives. And so we had an interest, and we began sharing this technique with each other where we would share turns. He would facilitate for me. I would facilitate for him. We ended up doing several hundred hours of this work together, and that was enormous in the effect it had in this internal wisdom building. And I began to see how enormous processing past trauma really is, and that it gives you a freedom, but it also gives you a wisdom. It gives you insights. It gives you a connection to something deeper than just even your rational mind. There's a body-mind connection there that the trauma we know is actually stored at the cellular level in the body, and then getting that to come up and out and then to integrate that into something that has wisdom is enormously powerful. And so that was where I discovered this as the first fundamental. And of course, there's many other ways of addressing and processing past trauma. And I would say probably the least effective appears to be direct, just talk therapy. Hey, let's talk about your problems. Tell me what you've been through in your life, and we'll try to find lessons that way. That does not seem to be that effective, in my opinion, and in my experience in life. There's some sort of subconscious level to this that needs to be tapped into. And it appears that the technique that I was using has the propensity to allow for that. And there's many other types, and I'm not experts in those other types. And that's why this talk is so great and it's so huge. Processing past trauma is some people's main life focus and professional focus. And it's something you can become very skilled at. And that's actually a big part of these skills, is that each and every one of these skills is a lifelong journey. And so that means that it's very unlikely, if not impossible, that any one person could master all 8 in one lifetime. The second root fundamental is what I call not doing. Other people might refer to this as meditation, but I call it not doing for a very specific reason. And it has to do with the fact that all 8 root fundamentals are deeply intertwined and interconnected with each other. So there's an interesting thing when it comes to trauma, is that folks that have a lot of unresolved trauma seem to also have a great deal of trouble sitting still without stimulation and without distraction and things to keep them from ruminating on the symptoms of that trauma's ongoing impact in their conscious minds and their conscious experience. And so you can immediately start to see that connection there. So for anyone who has any past trauma, sitting still for any period of time without screen time, without any type of stimulation whatsoever, can become a very uncomfortable affair. You start to see that people will either become extremely fidgety, start to go into very unpleasant emotional states. In really severe situations, they might actually start to dissociate or even go catatonic. But that is not the same thing as being in a state of presence in a not doing mode. That, of course, there are some people who spend their entire lives dedicating themselves to building the skill of not doing. And we could cite examples like maybe Tibetan monks meditating in the Himalayas for 30 years straight. Right? That is a very difficult skill to master. To really achieve not doing at its highest level, I would say, is the ability to stop the rational mind, to reach a point in which the mind achieves a place of complete lack of language, no more language-based thought whatsoever. And I've experienced that a handful of times in my life. I am definitely not a master of meditation or not doing. And I've experienced it on things like Datura. I've experienced it fasting. And I've also experienced it serotonin agonists like LSD and mushrooms, but in a different format with those. Moving along to the third root fundamental, that is connecting with nature. And connecting with nature is really important, even for people who I would say they may not have a strong affinity to nature for whatever reason. I think they should challenge themselves to get a bit more connection with the natural world. After all, we really do come from nature ourselves, and we've done this great job of creating this society that in some of the more concrete urban jungle areas, you're almost completely separated from our natural origins. There's another aspect of connecting with nature that 2 main aspects are really important. One is that nature, if you pay close enough attention to it, you will find that it has cycles of doing and not doing, and actually leans more towards not doing than doing. And if you look at humanity and you look at our society, we're actually completely opposite of that. We're almost always consumed with doing. The other important aspect of nature is mortality. It brings you face to face with mortality, something that here, especially in the West, especially in the United States, we sweep death completely under the rug, and it's this uncomfortable topic that we do not address. And that was, for me, very important when my father died, in playing a role in the deep mental health challenges, because it was not taught. It was not addressed. It wasn't mentored on how to face death, especially the death of someone that was very close to me, that I loved, that I cared about, that was a family member. Or again, later when my dear girlfriend died, no one taught me what to do there. And nature is very clear in showing that mortality is a part of the life cycle and a natural part of it. And so that gives us the ability to do some introspection on our beliefs around death, which then leads us to number 4. And number 4 is auditing our beliefs. Belief, this is where I've arrived now, and I've sat with these 8 root fundamentals for a few years now as I developed them. And I didn't pick the order initially for any real specific reason. And I just realized that the 4th root fundamental we're talking about is smack dab in the middle of the foundation. That is actually for good reason. Beliefs affect everything around your mental health journey, everything around your mental health journey. And you don't even realize it oftentimes, because beliefs happen at the speed of electricity in the brain synapses. They are happening automated for a lot of us. And I would theorize and argue that's part of the developing of a larger and larger default mind network, to use Michael Pollan's term from the book, How to Change Your Mind. That DMN is this thing that grows over time and begins to have a bunch of fragmented and disjointed codings, where our minds are very similar in ways, especially our rational, logical portion of our mind that's based in language is very similar to computers and how they operate on a logical level there. And there's coding that's happening within us, and that coding is actually rooted in belief. And this is something that I learned while my girlfriend was still alive, and that led me to developing those 3 root fundamentals of what true noble love is, was that I realized I had beliefs that were causing me to react in certain ways to circumstances in front of me, and that those beliefs were happening so quickly that the reactions would happen also at an automatic level. And then as I began to gain an awareness, I got to see that some of the beliefs that I held were harming me. They were not good for me. They were hurting me. Even some of these beliefs came directly from some of the, what I call societal scripting, some of the societal norms that were drilled into me, at least through my parents and maybe my schooling years, and those things were not all positive. There were some very negative ones there, and they were harming me. And so I won't get too deep into those specifics. I can save some of that stuff for another episode, another time. But I began to realize, wait a second, I should choose beliefs that don't harm me and don't harm other people, and that instead encourage well-being in me, a feeling of peace, a good-naturedness with other people that foster stronger relationships, that foster people around me feeling good about their interactions with me. And that's a powerful change to see that, and then to start to address beliefs. Because then also, remember, what led to this was talking about mortality within nature. Then that also leads to beliefs around death. And then choosing beliefs around death are going to affect how you deal with grief and how you deal with someone who does pass in your life. And then how you deal with facing your own mortality. And so beliefs are wildly powerful. So powerful, I can't say enough about it here, but I don't want to spend too much time. Moving on, because now this links to the next root fundamental. As you can see, as I said, your beliefs will have a deep impact in your interactions with other people, with other humans, with your relationships. And so the 5th root fundamental is relationship building, relationship maintenance, and relationship repair. And these are skills, again, to reiterate, each number that we've touched upon is a lifelong journey, a lifelong skill. And there are some people whose focus is specifically on relationship building, relationship maintenance, and perhaps relationship repair. Many people will follow through cycles in the relationships, and a lot of times maybe cycles of toxicity. And one of the reasons that happens is because they don't have an understanding of relationship repair. For instance, with relationship repair, there is a very delineated structure. There are 5 steps to relationship repair. And those 5 steps, if followed, give you a much higher probability of repairing a relationship that's gone through damage, that may have gone through transgression, that may have gone through betrayal. to establishing it back to a level of trust and not seeing a reoccurrence of the issue that caused the rift in the first place. Those 5 steps, I'm not going to get into because that in itself is its own talk. And I want to make sure there's plenty of explanation, because sometimes I get people who challenge some of this stuff and say, wait a second, I don't agree with the 5 steps. And we have to go into a deep discussion of why they are what they are. And then we start talking about people like Nelson Mandela and things like these gods of relationship repair. Now, the 6th fundamental is diet and exercise. Very important for your mental and emotional state. And then also breath work. Breath work is so powerful, I almost was going to make there be 9 root fundamentals, but I saw it as kind of falling in the same area as diet and exercise. But as I said earlier, breath work actually saved my life, and so enormously powerful. And there are people who spend their entire lives focused on diet, focused on exercise, focused on breath work. Taoist monks who practice Qigong will spend their entire lives breathing and bringing extreme intentionality to breath work. And so this area here has the ability to affect your overall mood, to change your energetic state. And that then in turn can affect your mood, that affects how you see your beliefs and how you may be able to see certain negative beliefs that maybe you want to let go of. If you're so stewed in the negative energies and the negative states and the toxic stagnations within yourself, it will feed the negative beliefs. So there's all these feedback loops that can go on that are all part of this matrix of the 8 root fundamentals. So it's really important to see that. 7th root fundamental is a very simple one, actually. It's called embracing discomfort. And if you look back at the prior 6 root fundamentals that I've mentioned so far, each and every one of them will bring you face to face with discomfort at some point. And growth doesn't happen without a certain amount of discomfort, right? It's like the old Arnold Schwarzenegger days of weightlifters and stuff. No pain, no gain, right? And of course, that got blown way out of proportion, and people took that to a dangerous and negative place. But there is a certain truth to that. You need to be willing to expose yourself to discomfort in many different ways in order to grow and in order to break through certain glass ceilings and have breakthrough moments and realizations. And it will take a certain amount of willingness to face discomfort. And so it's a really simple root fundamental, but a very important one. And some people also spend their whole lives doing this and just facing discomfort. I would say someone like David Goggins, right, just spends his whole life building an enormous skill set around simply facing discomfort. And it's paid a lot of dividends for him. It's really done something enormous for him. So it's also a very powerful thing. The 8th root fundamental is a very philosophical one, and it's at what I would call the advanced kind of stage of all this. And I wouldn't say that you need to start here at all, but it does become of very real importance as you get further down the mental, emotional, spiritual skill development journey. This root fundamental I call mitigating ego. Now, this requires a disclaimer or a qualification or a qualifier, I would say, and that is that I am using a very specific definition of ego. This term is complex and used in different ways by a lot of different people. And some people have this feeling that ego may have some good portions and some bad portions, and that we really need ego to function and survive in our rational world, in our real world. And I would say that's a different definition than the definition I'm using. The definition that I will be using with referring to ego is a mindset within consciousness that is constantly obsessed with either the past or the future and always in a state of comparative mindset. So this particular mindset is never satisfied because it's always focused on the past or the future and always in a state of comparison. Even when the comparison is favorable to the individual, so they are the superior out of the comparison, it doesn't ever reach a point of fulfillment and satisfaction, then there's the next and the next and the next thing, and it leads to a never-ending emptiness that can never be fulfilled. This, I would argue, has been the state of our Homo sapiens species for approximately maybe a little over 10,000, maybe even closing in on 20,000 years, whenever the beginning of invasive, widespread agriculture took over. I would say that point in which we turned into landowners and began developing and specializing in technology and weaponry, I would say was the emergence of a kind of the rule of the ego. Mitigating the ego is a very tricky thing. The Toltec shamans of northern Mexico talk about this in a different way. They talk about this and they use the term cleaning the island of the tonal. It took me many years, actually a couple decades, before I really figured out what they meant by cleaning the island of the tonal. Cleaning the island of the tonal means that, first of all, you have to understand that this ego that I'm calling, that maybe we could call hubris, that could be another term for it, self-importance, if ego kind of strikes you as maybe not the right word. Some people won't resonate with the word because, like I said, the definition differences for some folks. That part of ourselves, this negative part of ourselves, only exists within the rational language-based mind. It does not exist outside of that. Now, there's some people out there that I've come across who have said it's not possible to exist in a conscious state without language-based thought. And I would have to say, because I've experienced it, that is untrue. It is very possible to be in a state of presence in which there's no language-based thought. In that state of presence, the ego cannot exist. I can also tell you that from personal experience. The way the ego's mechanisms work is based off of justification. So I often use road rage as an example of ego, and that ego is very contagious. The contagion works off of trigger points. So in a road rage instance, let's say someone cuts you off, then what happens is you flip the other driver off, pull up next to them, make sure they see that you're flipping them off. This triggers them. Maybe they flip you off. This begins a state of escalation. In worst case scenarios, this can escalate to pulling off the side of the road, maybe becoming aggressive even with the vehicles, God forbid, even ending in tragedy. And all over this idea that I'm defending something I'm justified over defending. In this case, the justification is that it's a personal safety issue. This person threatened my personal safety, and therefore I'm completely justified in teaching them a lesson and letting them know they're in the wrong. However, logically, it breaks down when you look at it from the perspective of, okay, if it really was a safety issue, you would want to get as far away from the dangerous threat as possible. And that's not what's happening in this case. So the logic already breaks down. However, we don't look at people who engage in road rage incidents the same way we might look at, say, a schizophrenic or someone who is completely has a break from reality. Because in the road rage incident, we see a perspective of rational cause and effect. Okay, this person cut them off. They got upset about it. They're angry. They didn't flip the person off. I can sort of understand that. When we start to look at people as losing total touch with sanity, it's because their justifications no longer match what the collective reality is. And I would say that actually all that is a further extension of the ego to an extreme level. And if you look at instances where people are suffering from these types of extreme mental health challenges and issues, that it is very self-centric around the experiences they're having, especially if you see someone like paranoid schizophrenic or whatever. Paranoid schizophrenia, you'll see someone who has all these machinations around all this crazy stuff that's focused on them, and they become a very important person in that story. That's all ego. My belief is that this extends to this very high level philosophical viewpoint of our world, that the question becomes, what even is the purpose of our lives? What are we doing here? The purpose of the universe at large. And I would say that it boils down to awareness, that the model that I've settled on through the psychedelic experiences is that we are experiencing some form of panpsychism, that consciousness is fundamentally a part of the fabric of our universe and is not solely contained in our brains or neural structures, and that the universe is tending towards an awareness of itself, and we as conscious beings are conduits towards that end. This would also mean that inanimate objects are actually conscious, but conscious in a way that a pebble has imperceptible gravity in space. A pebble does have gravity, but you need many millions of pebbles before you start to have a perceptible force of gravity. And so perhaps consciousness operates similarly. So when you look at a rock, you don't sense any sense of consciousness from it, but that's because it's imperceptible. In this model, which is the model that I've adopted, the universe is tending towards some opposite end of the original singularity. If the theory is correct on the Big Bang, which it kind of seemed to come back to again and again, then the opposite end of that will be a moment where the entire universe becomes fully aware of itself. And that is the direction we are heading in. In that trajectory, then ego is this sub-level of consciousness that is in the way of that realization. And it's an attachment to identity that isolates us from others. This is a false identity if it is true that the universe is completely interconnected and that what I'm saying is correct about this panpsychism model, then that illusion of that attachment to identity is in the way of us achieving that higher level of awareness. This is, again, going into a much higher level of kind of philosophical discussion of ego. When you look at ego in a day-to-day, much more mundane level, you'll find that if you're able to mitigate it, you'll have much better relationships. You'll find yourself far more at peace, and you'll find yourself flowing through society and through life with far less friction and issues. And you'll find an enormous power in merging with the universal force. This comes back to martial arts again when you read Eiji Yoshikawa's epic adventure story of the greatest samurai that ever lived, Musashi. He talks about after his last duel when he realizes that he's defeated Kojiro in the final duel, that he has this moment of realizing that he's no longer the sky, he's no longer the clouds, he's no longer the ocean, he's no longer the island he's standing on. He is once again Musashi himself. And that means he's come back into his ego a bit, his individual persona. And this idea is that merging with something bigger than oneself has an almost unstoppable ocean-like force to it. Mirai Yeshiba, the founder of Aikido, was attributed the quote that once someone picks a fight with me, they've already lost because they've broken harmony with the universe, and I am the universe. That quote that he's attributed with actually is far older than he is, I believe, especially after understanding Musashi's journey. And I'm sure this began way before Musashi as well, who was more in the, believe, mid-Edo period. That's my discussion. I'm going to leave it there because I've only got so much time. There's so much information there that we could go deeper into. Thank you very much, and look forward to talking about other topics related to this that anyone wants to hear.